this video tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make these really cute stacker type of rings. And what we're going to be using is sterling silver wire, and I'm also going to show you how to do this with copper wire. It's really the same techniques, but if you don't have access to sterling, or it's not something that's affordable for you, you can also use copper. So the copper that I'm going to be using, I'm harvesting out of some wire that I purchased at a home store. And so I just peeled back the shielding, and I'm going to take a piece of this wire. Let me zoom out here. And I've included in the notes below the video the chart for measuring to get the proper ring size. So I've already set my caliper. This here is sterling silver wire I purchased from Rio Grande. It's 12 gauge sterling wire. And so I've taken the measurement for 12 gauge and set it on my calipers, and I'm going to make marks using both ends of my caliper so I know how long this ring shank needs to be my desired size. And so I'm just going to emphasize that with the Sharpie marker there. And I'm going to do the same thing with the copper. The copper wire I've got here is 14 gauge. So I'm going to put my measurements on here for 14 gauge. Now you'll see that I'm not going all the way to the end, and that will become evident when I show you how we're going to cut this. So I'm going to mark there, and I'm going to mark there. And again, I'm going to emphasize that with Sharpie so it's easier for me to see when it comes time to do the cutting. So I'm going to use some flush cutters, and I'm going to cut these pieces off. I'm cutting below my Sharpie line. And we're going to cut this one as well. Okay. So you can use the bender to make your bends. You can use ring bending pliers. You can pound it around a steel mandrel. If you want to do forming by hand around a steel mandrel, it's best to anneal first. We're going to go over to the bending press, and I'm going to show you how to do the bends on these pieces of wire for the rings that we're going to make. All right, so I've got the largest mandrel. I'm going to use that in the shallow channel, and I'm going to turn that just enough so I don't come up end to end. I want it to come up to where they bypass each other. So like I said, for you that don't have the bender or have, maybe your own preferred way of bending your ring shanks, then by all means bend it in whichever way you're most comfortable with. So what I want to create is a bypass area. Okay, I'm going to push that in just a slight bit, and hopefully you can see where I left my marks. I want those marks to line up. Okay, I want those marks to line up because that's where we're going to make our cut, is where those marks are. And let's get the copper wire done. So I'm working with 12 gauge sterling and 14 gauge copper. Going to be the same techniques for either material. Okay, and I'm going to get my lines lined up. Okay, now we're going to go and we're going to cut. Okay, so I'm over at the bench pen, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut straight through with the jeweler's saw across those lines. I'm going to put this right here, in the crook of my bench pin, and I'm going to cut right straight through those lines. And you can see that's why I wanted these areas to overlap. What this does is creates a perfect cut. Okay, there's one. I'm going to do that with the sterling piece. Just I'm going to even that up a little bit with some nylon pliers, just so they are a little bit more flat rather than poking up away from each other. Line up those marks and cut straight through. Okay. So I've got those both cut straight through. Now I need to line these up, and that's just a matter of bringing them together. Now, one of the really important keys in soldering is to not be able to see any light through your seam. So if you hold it up to the light, let me hold it up to the light for me. If I can see light through the seam, then I know the pieces aren't touching and the solder is not going to flow properly. So I'm going to go one way, then I'm going to bring it back and go the other direction to bypass. Bring it back to the center and just keep wiggling until you get it lined up. Okay, you should not be able to see any light through that at all. Okay, same thing with the sterling. And if you cut the way I showed, you should always have a perfect fit. Okay. Get everything all lined up there. And beautiful fit, no light seen through. All right, so we're going to get ready to solder these together. If you're going to do a bunch of rings, it's really nice to get them all done at the same time. Say you want to make a dozen rings, go ahead and get them all formed and all shaped and ready to go, and then you can solder them boom, 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 one right after the other. So for rings, for a joint that's under stress, like a ring would be, you want to always use hard or medium solder. I have some hard solder here. We carry this on our website. I'm going to use a chip this big, very, very tiny. And I'm going to place it down on my solderite board. Same thing with that one. And what I'm going to do is put them where I want them to be. And I'm going to lay the seam right on top of the solder chip. So I'm going to use My-T-Flux, which I put in a spray bottle. And I'm fluxing both of those pieces. I'm using an acetylene torch. You can use a smaller torch, a smaller butane torch, or a plumber's torch, but it is going to take longer for your solder to melt because the heat is not as extreme. Okay. You want to heat the entire piece, not just the area that is to be soldered. It's not the flame that melts the solder. It is the heat of the piece. You can see the solder flowed right directly into the seam. Copper takes more heat, requires more heat to melt. And you can see how it just drops right down, and the solder goes right up into the seam. You can see where the solder was down here. And if you watch carefully, you can watch the solder, it just goes right up into the seam. And that's because solder follows the direction of heat. So with our heat up here, solder travels towards that. So I'm going to pop these into the pickle and quench them, then pop them into the pickle, get them cleaned up, and then we'll be back. All right, these are fresh out of the pickle. So what we're going to do right now, let me go back out a little bit, is I'm going to do the shaping to make sure the ring is perfectly round. And you can see how it's not round. So that's what we're going to do now, is we're going to make sure it's completely round. And all we're doing is putting it onto a steel mandrel. And I'm using this weighted mallet to tap it around. And then you can look up above and check. And just keep checking till it's round. Pull down as you go. Always go both directions. So flip it over. Because it's tapered here. It doesn't matter so much on a narrow ring like this. You still want to do from both sides. Where it becomes more important is on rings that are wider. Okay, so I've got a nice round shape there. I'm going to check my copper one. I'm going to do the same thing. Check for roundness. Flip it around. And that looks good. Okay, if you have a little bit of wonkiness, you can see that that's not quite straight. What you can do is you can put it between. I've got a rubber block here and a steel block. I'm going to put it between those. I'm going to tap down, and that will straighten it up entirely. Same thing with this one. Okay, so these are all nice and round. So if you've done a good job with your soldering, you'll have very little solder to clean up. Got a little bit right there. You'll see it more on the copper just because of the color difference. Let me turn this light away a little bit so maybe you can see things a little bit clearer. Okay, you can see a little bit of solder there. So we need to do a little bit of cleanup. Okay, I've got a rubber bullet put on to one of my rotary tools, and I'm going to use that to clean off the little bit of excess solder. Got to keep in mind that it doesn't take much solder to fill that tiny, tiny little gap. Even the chips I used, I could have used half as much. So any excess that you use, you're going to have to remove. So whatever solder you think you need to use, go with half of that or less. We do carry these little rubber bullets on our website. And then you can go all the way around. You can clean it all up with this. We're also going to clean it up on the bench buffer using some white and some red compounds. Go all around the inside. You really want to make sure you get as much excess solder off as you can, especially on the copper, because it will be evident otherwise. The best solder seams, I will say it over and over again, the best solder seams are the ones you never know are there. So I find it really important to take my time to ensure that my solder seams are not visible to the best of my ability. Okay, I'm going to take these over to the bench buffer now, and we're going to polish them up with some white and some red compounds. Alrighty, here at the bench buffer, as you can see, it gets used a lot. I'm going to do them one at a time. I find rings are the easiest to polish when I put them on the steel mandrel. This is the harder wheel, the stiffer of the two. The one on the other side is softer, and we'll approach that one in a moment. The white is abrasive, so it does remove material. It's really wonderful for sterling because it does remove small scratches and little nicks and things. It's beautiful for that. If you were doing the silver plated, you want to be very gentle using white because you can strip the silver plating. Sterling is a much more forgiving metal and can really get a beautiful shine using the white compound. You want to make sure you have major nicks and scratches and things out before you do white compound, because the white is not going to eliminate deep scratches, okay? It's just going to more shallow them over. So just a tad of white compound. And hold the ring with your finger. Always stay underneath the 3 o'clock mark. If you go up above, whip it right out of your hand. Okay, do the other side. As you can see, that got the top side, but the bottom side there needs some polishing. Okay, now we're going to do the copper. If you find when you're using the bench buffer with a white compound, if you find you get a lot of black gunk on your jewelry, you've got too much compound on your wheel. So don't add any more compound until you don't see lots of black gunk on there. Okay, and then we're going to flop it around. Other side. All right. Get these nice and smooth and shiny and flawless. Then we can move on to the red. Red compound is where we really pick up the shine. So we're going to do the same thing with red. Start with copper. Sterling. Okay, if you've done a good job to start with, you don't have a whole lot of work to do to get them really nice and bright and shiny. So I'm going to get myself washed up and then we're going to move on to the next step. Okay, so what I have here are tools from Wubbers, and they are ring and earring presses, and each one does a different pattern. And just get those cleaned up real quick. So it's a 3-part tool. You have your upper part, your upper former, and you have a lower former, and these are matching formers. Okay, and then the cylinder. So you're going to, and there's a pin on the side, and that lines up with a groove there. You're going to line that up so that sits down inside. You're going to put your ring on top, and you're going to line it up in the center. I'll show you how it looks here. You're going to line that up in the center best you can. Then you're going to put the top former on with the slot. And I have a Bonnie Doon 20-ton benchtop press here. You can do this with a hammer as well. If you have a hydraulic press, it does make it easier. And let me turn this up. We'll focus in. And how much pressure you put on here is really something you're going to have to gauge for yourself. If you want a ring that's got a lot of definite bends to it, you're going to want to press more. If you want it to have more subtle shape, you're going to press less. I find that I've had to kind of experiment. It's easier to do a little and then go back and add a little bit more bend to it than it is to bend it too much and get it all squished out and flat. Although that may be exactly what you're looking to do. So I found about 3 presses. Once the ram hits that and I start to feel some force, I find about 3 full presses works well for me. And then I'm going to release. And with a hammer, obviously, this is going to be more difficult to gauge. And let me turn this back down. And we'll see what we got here. I might have to smack them apart. And there you have your formed ring. Let me get that cleaned off there. There's grease that come on these tools, but you want to keep a small amount of grease on it to keep these stainless tools, or excuse me, these steel tools from rusting. Okay, so that's what that looks like in copper. I'm going to do, let's do a different one. We'll put this one aside. We'll grab a different one. These, there are 6 different shapes. We just started carrying these on our website. So you can order these. Let's see here what we have, what we can go with. So that's the former on that one. That has a smaller profile. That has kind of a medium profile as far as the waviness goes. This has more of a sharper edge, so I think we'll go with this one. Pull that out. Same thing. We're going to drop the ring in. You could do this to make earrings. You know, as I've always said, you're only limited by your own imagination. And we're going to put this back up in the press. You got to make sure you hold that bottom or the whole thing will slide right out. Okay, I'm going to raise it up until I start to feel pressure. Now I'm going to give it 3 pumps. 1, 2, 3. To me, that seems to work pretty well. Release it just enough to get my former out. And we'll open this up. Let's see what we've got. And there you go. Let me get the grease cleaned off of that. So that gave us a nice profile there. So now we have 2 different rings, 2 different profiles. And there are 6 in total. You can take a look at these tools on our website. I'll put links to everything down underneath the box. If you have any questions, be sure to ask and I'll be happy to answer them for you. And we'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.